Good evening, everyone. I hope you guys had a great day. I hope all of you mothers out there had a wonderful Mother's Day. We are here again tonight to talk to a creative in the industry. We are welcoming Dan Waters, who you will know from DC Comics, from Homesick Pilots, Vault. So welcome to the show, Dan. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, no, this is great. And this is actually very special for everybody watching. It's only 5:15 here in Sacramento, California, and welcome to Sacramento, California, sir.
Thank you very much.
But
Weather's lovely.
Yes, it is. It was only 93 today, so it wasn't bad. You are actually in London at the moment, and it is what 1:30 in the morning?
Yeah, it's 1:20.
1:20, not so bad. Not so bad at all. Well, I really appreciate you joining us at such an awkward hour. That is really amazing of you. But one of the neat things when we were talking before we got on here is this isn't so abnormal for you, because since you're working with a lot of American publishers now, your schedule is completely flipped.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I'm not working. I don't think I'm working for any British publishers at the moment. So everyone sort of sends me emails at I sort of start getting emails sort of 5 p.m. my time. So it's easier. It's definitely easier to just be on a little bit of an American sort of tilted schedule.
And that makes perfect sense. So well, then let's start with just you. Were you born and raised in London?
Yep, I'm one of those people who sort of stayed rooted in one place.
Okay. And you must love it then, because I stayed rooted right here in the Sacramento area, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah, it's one of those sort of things of like I've never lived. I don't think I've ever lived outside of London for much longer than sort of 6 months. Like I've traveled quite widely, but I always sort of end up back here. And I think particularly if you live in a big city like this, it very sort of gets in your bones, and you get used to get used to how sort of crowded it is and those sort of like negative sides, and then you very much miss the bustle and the sort of access to things. To everything. If you're somewhere else.
Yeah, whether it be food or activities, any of that kind of stuff. Now, then, were you always a comic reader? Is this something that has been part of your life since you were little?
I think like a lot of people. I mean, there's a Alan Moore quote where he says like in Britain you don't really sort of get comics, you just sort of have them like rickets. They're just something you sort of get thrust upon you because we sort of had the Beano and the Dandy and those sort of things from like very young age. And then the American stuff we had in these sort of weird collections where you'd have three American comics like Spider-Man or three sort of like different DC comics sort of like stapled together, released over here, and those would be in the sort of more accessible. You wouldn't have to sort of go to like the actual comic shop, and when you're sort of 8, obviously that's kind of less likely. And I think I have the same story as like a lot of people, where I sort of like fell out of it, and then when I was a teenager, I sort of discovered the like Sandman trade paperbacks in the library, and sort of head over heels fell back into comics.
Okay, then you kind of answered one of my questions that I was just curious about, the accessibility of American comics with you growing up. So they didn't just send the individual issues that you could pick up?
And we have comic stores, where we have the same, but they're essentially an import over here. So, but this was like, at least when I was a kid, I don't know how if it's quite the same, but like literally in the newsagent. So they were on the newsstand, but they were these collected they were reprints, and so they were sort of a few years behind like what was actually happening in American comics. But I found a lot of sort of like all the sort of Spider-Man like Identity Crisis and stuff, and like I sort of like had a couple of these things, and I would like read them over and over, and then I sort of found them, and I found them sort of more recently, and I went back, and I was like, oh, no wonder like I was so into these. It's literally sort of like Peter David's Hulk and Kurt Busiek's Iron Man, and like all of this sort of stuff just like parceled together.
Well, they combined good ones then.
Yeah, they really did.
Which is absolutely fantastic. So then when you were reading this as a kid, you're growing up, you said you fell out a little bit. Did you have any clue that you might want to be writing comic books as an adult back then? Or was this something that you discovered when you came back into it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always, there was always a part of me from very young. I was always sort of very, I read everything. And I always liked the idea of being a writer because it seemed like, you know, it's like, what, you can actually get paid to do that and not have a real job. But the sort of specifically writing comics thing came quite a bit later. Like I started a film studies degree, which I didn't really get on with, and ended up switching to English when I sort of realized that I didn't really want to make films because the process is so slow. I mean, we talked a little bit backstage about like the lead time on comics, but with film, and there's so many other voices as well that get involved in the mix with film, whereas with comics you can really hone down and you and an artist can just make something that's very pure and very sort of, you know, you can have a very sort of clear vision without sort of compromising very much.
So had you worked on film at all before this, or was that just something you wanted to do?
No, it was something I was sort of gearing myself towards. It was like the career path I was sort of looking at. And then I sort of realized, I was reading more comics than I was watching films. So I was like, it suddenly made sense to have a go at comics.
Well, then, I mean, that's incredible in itself because, you know, a lot of us read comics and a lot of us want to make that jump, but you actually were able to make the leap. Now, was there anything in particular that allowed you to do that? Did you know people? Had you written before and submitted things? I mean, how did you get involved in the actual industry?
Well, I worked for a bit at this, like a very sort of small, like British publisher. And I met Casper Wingard there. And Casper is the artist on Limbo and the artist on Homesick Pilots. So you know that obviously worked out because we're still working together, sort of 5-6 years down the line. And I mean, Casper was already a fantastic artist, but he knew, and him and I just sort of got on, and he knew that I was serious about wanting to do this because he essentially watched me write an entire miniseries, which I knew was never going to get made. But I was like, if I'm going to ask an artist to draw something that I've written, I have to understand how this sort of thing works. And I have to sort of learn, I have to make my mistakes first before I sort of start wasting anyone else's time with it. So I sort of wrote entire series that I knew were never going to get produced, and I knew weren't good enough to get produced, but just like sort of putting myself through that sort of rigmarole and putting in the hours, and Casper saw that, and then we both had ideas for comics that we would sort of talk about in the pub, and we realized that quite a few of them worked together, and that basically those conversations turned into Limbo, which we then pitched at Thought Bubble, which is a Comic Con over here, and Image were here, and they were sort of taking pitches. You could sort of go through this sort of pitch process and send it to the festival, and then the festival would send it to Image, and then you could go and sort of pitch it in person. And we did that, and they picked it up. And so I was still finishing university at that time. So we started doing Limbo then, and it's just sort of gone from there.
I mean, okay, that's great. That's it. I mean, right off the bat, the one you guys are working with, you managed to land. Can you tell them a little bit about what Limbo is, and is it available for people to get through their local comic shops? Is it still in print?
Yeah. I mean, as far as I know, so Limbo is we sort of kept calling a sort of neon noir detective story, and it was it's a story about a detective with amnesia he's a guy who just woke up in this very strange city, who has no idea who he is, and he basically picks up his personality from detective novels, and sort of sets himself up as a PI, and he gets hired to protect a woman who he discovers is actually a form of goddess. So the things that are coming after her aren't necessarily people; they're weird sort of creatures and entities and abstract concepts. It was very much, I think, at the time we sort of felt that because this was sort of six years ago now, so 2015, 16, this started coming out. We felt that comics were leaning a little into the sort of idea of, we should get a film deal through this, and so we should make a comic that feels quite budgetable on cinema. And we thought, well, we're going to do the opposite of that, and we're just going to make the most comic-y comic. And so it's a sort of love letter to books like Doom Patrol and Swamp Thing and the sort of stuff that we really love.
That is one of the wonderful things about comics too, is that since there is no budget involved like that, you can just do whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, there's different sort of constraints in that, if you're asking an artist to draw 300 different people that are like specific, like, if you're like, okay, now you're showing all of the Avengers on like every page, then you're going to get throttled. But yeah, you can sort of push. There are definitely elements that the medium, I think, should and does like lean into best, and the sort of strangeness and the sort of bombastic and scale are things that I've always loved in comics. So,
and so that obviously went over well. What was the next project that you were able to land?
Oh man, now you're asking.
What? Oh, good.
Sorry.
No, go for
it. I wrote some. I did some Assassin's Creed comics, which I co-wrote with Alex Packardell, which was interesting to do, and that was my first sort of experience, like sort of license work and things. But also, to me, the big thing that came out of that was meeting Alex, because we didn't particularly know each other, and we just sort of had seen each other around, and we definitely clicked as writers. I suspect what happened is that there was a debate about which one of us should be picked for this gig, and they went, well, we'll just give it to both of them and see if they can work together.
And it worked out well.
Well, yeah, we're still, so after that we formed a writers studio with Ron V and Ryan O'Sullivan, which is White Noise. So that's sort of where I workshop a lot of my stories and things like now. We're still all very like tight.
So for people who don't know, what does a workshop like that, what does that offer you and everybody else involved, and what exactly is it?
Well, I mean, yeah, so we sort of call it a studio. There's no physical location. It's just the idea that we were 4 writers who were coming up around the same time, and we sort of found each other and realized we had quite similar ideas about like what we wanted to do in comics, where we thought comics should be sort of like headed, and so we kind of just banded together and started sending each other our scripts and workshopping them as far as sort of just giving feedback and stuff. So there's basically an editorial process or sort of access to an editorial process, and like sounding boards, that we can all sort of like just like lean on each other for that kind of stuff, which is really great in that it also, because comics is so small and people are so supportive of each other. Outside of the studio, there can be a little bit of a thing of people are supportive to the point where they won't tell you if you've done something crap. Whereas the studio is very much somewhere where the whole thing is built on a specific kind of respect, where we're all there because we know we like each other's work and respect each other's work, so we can sort of throw away the pleasantries and just sort of like tear chunks out of it. So it's a fire to forge stuff, and it lets you sort of take bigger risks because you've got a kind of safety net where you're going to get told if it doesn't work.
And that's got to be extremely useful because not everything that gets put to paper is going to necessarily be gold.
No.
So having that springboard is great, and I imagine it also creates a certain level of expectancy. So it keeps you giving stuff to them, producing more things, and just because you have them to rely on as well.
Yeah, definitely. And then also you're sort of inspiring each other, and we're also all kind of similar in certain ways, but also interested in similar things. But if you sort of put the same sort of source material through any of us, you get a very different thing out the other end, which is always a very interesting sort of thing, because we'll end up reading a lot of the same books and talking amongst ourselves about things, and so then we're working from similar source material, and it always comes out with different books. Like Alex, Ram, and I have all had sort of books in the mecha space in the last year or so, but they're such different books.
Now, was Coffin Bound one that you utilized through this source, or was that before?
Yeah, Coffin Bound, definitely. I got a lot of feedback on Coffin Bound from those guys, because Coffin Bound was a risky book, to say the least.
Now, why do you say risky? Because it was received really, really well.
Yeah, but I think because, I mean, with Coffin Bound was an attempt to do something. I have sort of theories about theater and comics, and how theater and comics are closer than most people tend to sort of examine. There are similar things that are heightened in both comics and theater. And I really wanted to lean on those sort of influences, on sort of like Samuel Beckett and Harold Pinter, and really bring that very heightened, dramatic flair, rather than sort of naturalistic dialogue and a world which sort of made sense.
Okay. And it wasn't just me, right? I mean, because it did really well here in the shop, and they were going back for multiple printings. Across the market. It did very, very well for you.
Yeah, I think we did 3 printings on issue 1, which was really cool. Like it was really cool to see sort of people turn out for a book that was kind of that strange and that like Danny and I decided to make something that was very sort of unflinching and very raw, and it was like, this might not make sense to anyone outside of us, but we're going to try and put it as pure onto the page as we can.
Well, I mean, we just got Skip and Tosh telling us how amazing it is. So if anybody else needs some confirmation,
thank you very much, Skip. Appreciate it.
I believe there's 2 volumes available at the moment.
Yes.
That are definitely in print. We have them on the shelf. If you are not local to Sacramento, or if you are and you're going somewhere else, just ask your retailer for them. If they're not on the shelf, they can still order them and get them in for you. So make sure you take care of that. But in order to entice them, I forgot, we didn't tell them what Coffin Bound was about.
Well, Coffin Bound's about a woman who is told that she is being hunted by an unstoppable killer. So the sort of thrust of the book is there is no way that this is not going to happen. She is coffin bound, literally. She's not coming out at the end of this book. So it's not about trying to overcome death, because none of us can do that. It's about what she decides to do with the time she's got left. And what she decides to do is to erase all trace of herself from the earth. So it's a sort of, it's all of that with a load of like car chases and gunfights and cults. So,
Okay, so yeah, that's available now. And of course, let's save the one that we've got up coming out here soon for the next one. You also did some DC work, and you actually did quite a bit of DC work.
I have, yeah.
And so what does that entail? Because you mentioned your reference or your inspirations, one of them being Sandman. What was it like to be able to put your foot in that universe? Because that's a very small number of people who have gotten to do this, and you're one of them. Yeah,
I mean, I got to write 24 issues of Lucifer, and I co-wrote some of House of Whispers with Narlo Hopkinson. Lucifer was a sort of thing that came about because I was talking to, like, back when Vertigo existed, I was talking to the editors there based on like they liked Limbo, and the sort of idea came up of like, oh, like we're also like the Lucifer TV show's coming out, and we're sort of talking about like Sandman stuff. Like, would you be interested in pitching a new Lucifer book? And I was like, I would be very, very interested in writing stories about the devil. So I sort of kept on at them about this sort of, with all sort of ideas. I was like, oh, what if we did this? What if we did that? And then they said, okay, we're going to do this whole line of Sandman comics, and we're going to fly to New Orleans because that's where Neil is right now, and we're all going to sit down with Neil and talk about the story. And that was one of the sort of and this was my first DC work as well. I hadn't done any sort of like backups or short things, so it was very it felt very sort of in at the deep end. And we sort of flew to New Orleans, and this was during like that massive cold snap, and it was I can never do Fahrenheit because it's Celsius over here, but it was -7 degrees Celsius in New Orleans, and there was ice on all the palm trees and snow all over the roads, and it was the most bizarre one of the most bizarre experiences of my life.
And was it at all intimidating working on a project like this with something that was such an inspiration to you to begin with?
I mean, I always try not to sort of think in those terms because I think there's a sort of slightly snotty, bratty side of me which always goes, if something feels like it's going to be if there's a weight behind it, then my instinct is to go the opposite direction. Because I actually discovered Lucifer, Mike Carey's Lucifer, the same time I discovered Sandman. Like, they had them all in the library, and I wasn't paying attention at that point who was writing things, who was, what was a shared universe or not. So I was just reading these things and just reading them out of order. So I'd love that Lucifer run right from the get-go, like when I got back into comics. And it's such a good run that I was like, well, I just don't want to retell any of this. I don't want to rehash any of this. I don't really want to reboot it either. So I'm just going to go in the opposite direction. And this is very much my Lucifer story. So rather than sort of trying to make it a seamless transition and worrying about, does this feel like Neil's book? Does this feel like Mike's book? This is my version of Lucifer. And
it immediately starts off completely different, and there's some mystery going on. We don't know quite what's happening, because
we immediately depowered Lucifer and trapped him somewhere and blinded him. That was the thing I was really interested in was the idea of. I remember going into the book sort of thinking, okay, this is a guy who is 6 foot tall, blonde dude with cheekbones and almost limitless power. And all he does is sort of whine and moan about not being happy about not being as powerful as God, or not being able to overthrow God. So what if we actually put him through what literally every single one of us have to go through? So we put him through actual physical pain, put him through like losing his senses, put him through sort of the discomfort of actual life.
And this seems like it was a good mix for you too, because you had mentioned that one of your probably your favorite character is the devil, which was interesting. But then your explanation was great. I love how you talked about the way it affects people. I'll let you do it. It's much better.
So when you sort of asked me like what my favorite character is, and I always sort of I have a side of me that sort of recoils from questions like that a little bit, just because I'm always far more interested in what's being done with the character and things rather than them intrinsically. You can write anyone well or write anyone badly. So but the devil as a sort of concept, as something that is, or someone who is immediately sort of transgressive and disruptive, but then also has this draw exactly because of that. And I think I said, so you could sort of look at Iago from Othello, who I think is like who fascinates me because he's like the only Shakespeare character that I can think of who doesn't ever really have a motive. He's just basically the devil, and he's just gonna make Othello's life miserable because he's this ball of hatred and jealousy. And you could look at Hannibal Lecter. Like, there's all these sort of characters and all these sort of like franchises who are just these embodiment of pure narcissistic fury. And they always just bring this like really, whenever they enter the room, they're suddenly like magnetic. and they make other characters make interesting decisions.
Yes, most
And
definitely.
That's what I love.
The way they affect the people around them is extremely interesting.
And Lucifer's very much that as well.
So you got your DC, you got that, but what I really want to talk to you about now, and we saved this for the last, is Homesick Pilots is out right now.
It is.
Yes, and the trades are coming out. Can you please tell them a little bit about this? Because, you know, Coffin Bound did great, but Homesick Pilots here has just done so well.
Homesick Pilots is the story of a teenage punk band who try and throw a gig in a haunted house, which then goes crazy and traps one of them within it. And the story is it's very much about trauma and about how we respond to trauma and how we sort of get stuck within it rather than being able to escape it. Like I saw too many sort of ghost stories recently where people sort of defeat the ghost and they overcome the trauma and the ghost goes away from the house. And I just don't think that's how it ever works. So Homesick Pilots is a book of how that doesn't ever work. And once you're part of it, it's going to be part of you. And I sort of, the image I think that a lot of people are like sticking with from Homesick Pilots is the house getting up and walking, which was definitely our sort of like thoughts in that direction. Like you don't ever escape the ghosts, you don't ever escape the trauma. But if you can learn to use it, if you can learn to live with it, then you can take it with you. And in our world, that manifests as a 60-foot house that stands up and gets in fights.
And the great thing, Murdoch, you just said you were looking forward to reading this one. You don't have much longer to wait if you haven't picked it up yet, because the first trade for Homesick Pilots comes out in what, a week and a half?
Yeah, I think was it the 19th? Yeah, so 10 days. So 10 days, volume 1, and then if you like that, then Arc 2 starts with issue 6, which is coming out next month. So now, we're going straight into book 2.
Is there a end to this one, or is this one open-ended?
Yeah, there's definitely an end. Like it's getting bigger and bigger as the books go on. So at a point, it's gonna have a definite end. But yeah, we've got a few more stories in the tank for sure before we get there.
Before you actually get there. So 19th, everybody, the Homesick Pilots trade is coming out. Of course, we'll have it down here at Empires. Let me know if you want it. I can reserve you a copy. And this is the perfect time to let your comic store know that you want it, so that not only can they reserve it, but they can up their orders. The only way they know to do that kind of stuff is if you let them know. So be very vocal with your comic shop as to what you want. So this is all, you've got a lot on your plate at the moment, but you've got more coming out. We can't talk about it. You've told me that.
Yeah.
It's under wraps. But there is plenty more coming with you. Oh wait, you just had some stuff with Vault real quick too.
Oh yeah, The Picture of Everything Else is the other book I have coming out right now. We have 3 issues of that out. That's a 5-issue miniseries about the artist who it's about the artist who painted the picture of Dorian Gray, because I always thought he was more interesting than Dorian himself. And that this is a guy who painted an immortal painting of a guy he fancied, and then he just gets kind of pushed out of the story. And I thought, well, what happened to that guy? What happened to the guy who can paint immortal paintings? And what if he then decides to paint something bigger than just a portrait? Which is why it's The Picture of Everything Else.
Of everything else. Nice. And I think we're only 2 issues or 3 issues in?
3 issues in, yeah. So two more to come, and then we're done. And
so there's plenty of time for you guys to jump on board and find those issues. You don't have to wait for the trade on that. And of course, much more coming from this gentleman. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Two more things. We always like to get just a little bit of insight from somebody who's done it, especially from somebody who has just come in and said, I'm going to do this, and made it work. If you had one piece of advice for anybody who wants to be in the spot that you're in, is there anything you could offer to them?
Well, I think kind of like what I said, you've just got to start making stuff. And I know that's sometimes seen as like kind of unhelpful because if you're an unproven writer, it can be difficult to convince artists to draw your stuff rather than to draw their own stuff or to work with the writer who's already established. But I think the more you put under your belt, even if you're just doing even if you're just scripting, you've just got to write and write and write until you feel you're somewhere along that journey.
And that you did talk about that earlier. You said even when you didn't think these books were ever going to get made, you were still writing. You were still doing.
Yeah, those books never did get made.
Okay, all right. They're just sitting on the floor somewhere.
Yeah.
But it does make sense because you're being creative. You're honing your craft. You're figuring out ways of doing things. And in your instance, and it could be for anyone else, you showed somebody, an artist, that you had the commitment, and they got on board with that.
Yeah, I think that's very much the key.
And one last question. So are you when it comes to hoodies, are you a pullover or a zip up?
I literally have one of each, just depending on my mood. I think
right down the middle.
Probably 70% zip up, just for ease of.
All right. These kind of questions just really get to the heart of someone. It helps me determine what kind of a person they are.
Yeah, like a Rorschach test.
Yes, exactly. And one last question. Sal asked, you mentioned a lot of books that have influenced you. Do the Devils in the Movies influences you as well, or is that not something that you do very often?
I mean, sure. Like there are some really, really good depictions. But I don't know. I very much tend to slip towards novels and things, particularly where the devil is related. The thing with the devil and cinema in particular is there's about 100 years of cinema, whereas basically all of human history we've been talking about the devil in some form or other. There are times in the book where in Lucifer where I have him refer to himself as the shadow on the wall. The shadow on the wall of the cave, because he's the first time a caveman saw a shadow on the wall of the cave and didn't know what it was. That's when the devil was sort of brought into our consciousness, or at least that's my theory.
You have a lot more to draw from. That is definitely true. Well, thank you very much, Dan, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time, especially since it's 1:30 in the morning now going on.
Yeah, no problem.
And we're looking forward to everything that you have coming up. We will, of course, continue to stock it. And if anybody needs anything, you need to get a hold of me. Let me know. Homesick Pilots Trade Paperback Volume 1 is coming out in a week and a half. So if you need it, make sure you put it on your saver or ask me to hold it for you. Thank you again, sir. You have a great night.
Thanks very much, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
And we're looking forward to seeing what you have next.
Thanks very much.
Yes.